Welcome back. Joining me to discuss more about faith and architecture is Dr. Shula Laderman. She is an art historian from the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. Terrific, Shula, to have you on the show. This is really one of your specialties. And there's always the question that comes up when we talk about architecture and Judaism, is there Jewish architecture, or has it simply been influenced by so many other cultures?
Definitely there is Jewish sacred space, but I wouldn't say that there is Jewish architecture, because Judaism normally lived, the people, even when they lived in the land of Israel, they were influenced by the cultures that they lived within. And so the architecture was always part of what they studied and learned from the surroundings. But there is a very definite concept of sacred architecture in Judaism.
And you say it goes back really to the tabernacle.
Yes, yes. The whole idea of Judaism and the arts, like in the Schechter, we have this department of Judaism and the arts, meaning that there is always in everything, as Jews lived throughout the centuries, they used different kinds of ways to express their sacred feeling and their connection to God. And the tabernacle is the first example, because in the Torah, it tells us that Moses goes up to Sinai to receive the Torah. And there God gives him also the instructions for building the tabernacle. And he tells them to build a tabernacle so that he could reside within the people, not in the tabernacle. And yet,
right, that's one of the kind of paradoxes of Judaism and sacred space, because even though the Bible tells us God instructs us to build a tabernacle, in the end, the Hebrew phrasing is that God will reside in the people, not in the place, per se.
Meaning that, and here it goes back to this idea of what happened in Mount Sinai. Because when he came up and God tells him, build a tabernacle in the pattern that I'm showing you. Now, what pattern did God have to show him? And the philosophical ideas is that it started with Philo, the Alexandrian, that God showed him the pattern of what he had created as an architect. What did God create as an architect? The world. So he showed them the pattern of creation as a godly work, and he was to build it as a human, as a man-made sacred space.
And based on words, which is a huge difference to the other religious movements, monotheism, Christianity, and Islam. For Judaism, it's about words again.
The idea was that here God is instructing him to take a special artist. He tells him, take Bezalel. He is in the shadow of God. I mean, God tells him exactly who his architect and artist will be. Yes, because he is going to, even Moses didn't know how to do it, Bezalel did. And he was able, and the rabbi said that he was able to do it because he knew the secret of the letters, the importance of the Torah, the importance of the special mystical idea of how to connect to God.
The Hebrew letters.
The Hebrew letters, and everything that's connected. And the way the tabernacle was created with the Ark of the Tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, we have the cherubim on top. Now that seems like images, but no, God talks from within the wings of the cherubim that raise their wings up, and the empty space is
space
where
between them.
Right. So that to teach the people that God is transcendental, He's beyond nature. He's the empty space, but He is connecting to humans through the commandments of the Torah.
That's what's fascinating when you look at Jewish sacred spaces, because in the way that the tabernacle, the sukkahs are built, there are these messages about monotheism, a transcendental God, to kind of wean the Israelites off of polytheism,
Paganism.
off of idol worship.
Yes.
So that, it's built into the very fabric of the sacred space.
Yes, and it's very much illustrated because it was a tent that was built when the cloud of God would lower and they would know they would stop at that particular space, build the tabernacle, which was like portable, and create that very sacred space in the middle, the Holy of Holies, that only the high priest can come in and only on Yom Kippur. And yet, when the cloud rose and they were supposed to move on, they would take it all apart, and that same very sacred space became a profane space, became sand, because that's not a place that is being holy, but is the idea of the sacredness.
Right, that's in people, in a sense, in their worship and service of God.
Exactly.
If we move forward, though, in time and we get to Jerusalem and the temples, their holiness seems to be anchored in one place, even with the destructions of the temple.
Yeah, but they couldn't build places all over the country. There was just one place. They had to come to the temple in Jerusalem. And so they would come 3 times a year. They would come to the temple. And that was the focal point. From there, things were the people were instructed. The calendar was determined according to the moon, whenever it was, a new moon, etc. So that it was very central. And then the second temple as well. And King Herod, when he went in, he rebuilt the temple, but he had to assure the people that he would do it according to the way it was done. Even though there was a big fight between Matityahu and Tigranes, who was the last of the Asmonean,
right,
and who was supported by the Persian, and King Herod was supported by the Romans, and yet Herod won. And he did rebuild the temple in such a way that they said whoever didn't see that beautiful temple never saw a beautiful place in his life. And yet it was not with images. It was really strictly not with no images.
Right, which is obviously what links all synagogues together.
Right.
But even when the temple was destroyed, there was a kind of holiness, or some of the rabbis call about it the Shekhinah, the presence of God, which seems to continue to rest in that space. And as you've written about, the kind of memory of the temple and what it stood for had a huge influence on the way Jewish tradition and theology kind of developed over time.
Definitely. We see it in art. We see it from the coins of Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba issued the coins in the year 132 when he opened his rebellion against the Romans. And there is the front of the temple, like 4 pillars and an image in the middle of the Ark of the Covenant. And in the back are the lulav and the 4 species. Why? Because in the time of the temple, they would have the lulav, the 4 species of Sukkot, all 7 days of the holidays. But outside the temple, only 1 day. Once the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said it should be done by everybody the whole 7 days. Meaning the idea was to continue the practices of the temple without the sacrifices, but all the practices, so that people will feel that they still have the sacred feeling within them.
And in the early years after the destruction of the temple, even the entrances to the temples were in relation to Jerusalem. Of course, also the direction of the prayer, which is something that has really survived to this day.
This is very interesting because King Solomon, when he dedicates his first temple, he says in the prayer, he says that when there will be no temple, people should pray towards, if they are outside of Israel, towards Israel. If they are in Israel, towards Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, towards the temple. In the temple, towards the temple of the Holy of Holies. Meaning, he already put that direction into the mind of the people, that they always have to be focused by the centrality of the temple. And this is what happens. Synagogues all over the world turn towards Jerusalem in their prayers. Jews and the synagogues themselves. And we can see it in the very early synagogues. like the synagogue in Dura Europus, that is a very amazing discovery that was in the beginning of the 20th century.
The idea of rebuilding the temple today, very controversial. We don't have so much time left, maybe a minute, but
Yes.
if you can kind of enlighten our audiences a little bit about the controversy surrounding a third temple.
Okay, there's a very strong controversy because the idea was that once the temple was destroyed, the sacrifice was turned into prayers. And most people feel that this is what is the idea. There should be a redemption, there should be, if Messiah comes, but the worship is already a worship which is different than the worship of sacrifices. And many of the rabbis said that too. And yet there are some people who feel that we have to bring back what was.
Right, and in the end, many say people now are going to have to wait until the time of the Messiah. Thank you so much, Dr. Shula Laderman.